The Little Mermaid for Game Boy, released in 1993 by Capcom and based on the 1989 Disney animated movie of the same name, is essentially a portable version of the NES game released about 2 years prior. That means it retains the same gameplay, the same levels, and some of the same graphics and sound. Doesn't quite have the same polish, however. So much like the NES game, you play as Ariel, the Little Mermaid thing who has to save the sea from the evil sea witch Ursula. How well does this follow the movie? About as well as the NES version did, so yep. Anyway, you guide Ariel through 5 relatively straightforward levels, each scattered with evil critters and hidden treasures. Your main means of attack is shooting bubbles at enemies, which will trap them in larger bubbles that you could pick up and toss at other enemies to kill them. On the other hand, you could also toss said trap foes into little holes that will yield bonus items and healing hearts. You could also use your fin to dig up items in the sand. In addition, there are treasure chests which can only be opened with conch shells or some other blunt means, which will unveil pearls of either dark or bright varieties. Dark pearls increase the strength of your bubbles to the point where you can move large rocks and ensnare baby octopi into your bubbly trap, while bright pearls will increase the range of your attacks. If you lose a life, which happens when all your health hearts are depleted, you not only restart at the last invisible checkpoint you pass, but you lose all power-ups and are back to the rinky-dink whirlwind thing. Controls fairly straightforward. A button shoots bubbles and grabs onto other things, while holding down the B button makes you swim faster. Ariel's movement in the Game Boy version feels a bit more stiff compared to the NES version. Like, it's not quite as smooth, but it's not necessarily detrimental to the overall experience. Now, for all intents and purposes, if you played The Little Mermaid on the NES, then you've played it on the Game Boy since it's pretty much the same game structurally speaking. You play the same levels, you fight the same bosses, and thus can probably finish this game in less than half an hour due to its short levels and relatively lower difficulty. It does run a little slower, which is to be expected. Collision detection can also sometimes hiccup every so often, especially with this large rock that I could easily roll off the steps in the NES version, but here, it's a virtual impossibility. And since everything is crammed to fit the little Game Boy screen, there are some differences in terms of real estate, as everything might appear smaller than before, including the space you get to navigate in, but nothing too drastic, which is something, I suppose. For what it's worth, Capcom did a fine job porting the Little Mermaid NES game over to the Game Boy, which is a typically impressive feat considering how such straight conversions don't often make the transition smoothly. And while this port isn't quite as polished as the NES original, it still plays and runs well enough to not be considered an unmitigated disaster in porting. This includes the graphics, which, for the most part, made the transition fairly well. There's obviously a lesser quality to the sprite work due to the slight reduction in scaling, and some background elements are missing from this version, but for the most part, it does indeed look the part, and almost scratches the surface of almost being a dead ringer for the console version, save for some minor details here and there. Sound, on the other hand, is a bit of a letdown. Sound effects aren't much to comment on, they're there for the sake of being there, but the soundtrack, while the same as the NES version, doesn't quite sound as good. Under the Sea, which plays on the title screen and probably the only song from the movie, sounds butchered in this version, and the original tunes, well, they fare a little better, but not by much. On its own merits, it's fine sounding, I suppose, but compared to the older version, it's missing a touch. Overall, The Little Mermaid on Game Boy is not that bad of a port of an NES game that's not that bad of a game. The lesser quality of some aspects of the port aside, it's still a perfectly fine little entry-level game you give to the younger kids who can't quite grasp the fundamentals of running and jumping or something to that extent. In any event, the NES version is the better version, but this one ain't too bad either.